Well, thank you. Good afternoon, or good morning, actually. Welcome to Washington. Welcome to this town that combines Southern efficiency with Northern hospitality. And I will say, by your presence here, you have made the town markedly better, because it is always better when Texans are in Washington. There's an infusion of sanity in this town. Let me thank you for the difference each of you guys make. Water is life. And in Texas, that's especially true. That's true for agriculture, for farming, for ranching. That's true for families and a growing economy. And so the work each of you are doing is critically important to the strength and vitality and future of Texas. You know, we're at a time, really, I think, of enormous opportunity and enormous transition. We've got right now a Republican president, Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, and an opportunity, I think, to do an awful lot of good. And looking back on 2017, I will say I'm very encouraged by what we were able to deliver on in 2017. When we started the year in 2017, to my mind, there were four big priorities: tax reform, regulatory reform, Obamacare, and judges. My view was, if we could deliver on those four, it would be an historic year, having a profound impact on the country going forward. And if we failed to deliver on any of those four, it would be a heartbreaking missed opportunity. And for much of last year, it wasn't clear which one it was going to be. There were periods, I suspect, where an awful lot of people here were very frustrated that it seemed Washington couldn't get its act together and actually deliver on what we'd promised the voters we would do. But as the year ended, I was deeply gratified at what we were able to come together and accomplish together. Starting with tax reform, in December, we passed a major tax cut. A tax cut focused first and foremost on jobs, on reducing taxes on small businesses and job creators. Taking the corporate tax rate, which was the highest in the developed world, 35%, higher than virtually all of Europe, higher than the United Kingdom, higher than France, higher than Germany. Ireland, their corporate tax rate's 12.5%. So we had been seeing for the last decade jobs and companies fleeing America and going overseas where they could get more competitive tax rates, and high-paying jobs leaving our great nation. Well, the tax cut took that 35% rate, the highest in the developed world, it cut it down to 21%, just below the average in the OECD, creating an environment much more attractive for companies to invest, to open new factories, to create new jobs. Simultaneously, we ended the double taxation on overseas profits. U.S. companies have about $2.9 trillion in capital overseas that they hadn't brought back because it was subject to double taxation at the highest rates in the developed world. And by ending that, we now have strong incentives for that capital to come back here and again open new factories, invest in new equipment, create new jobs. On top of that, we provided for immediate expensing for capital expenditure. A farmer buys a new tractor. A factory owner invests in new equipment. Instead of depreciating that over a number of years, you immediately expense it, which is a powerful pro-growth element. That was on the business side. On the individual side, individual rates at every tax rate lowered, so that Texans as a whole are seeing a dramatic decrease in their tax liability. The standard deduction doubled from $12,000 per couple to $24,000 per couple. Now, what that means is that starting next year, 90% of taxpayers will be able to fill out their taxes on a postcard. That's a dramatic simplification. Now, personally, I wish it were 100%. I still think we need to continue fighting for a simple flat tax where we abolish the IRS. But this is a good step in the right direction. 90% of taxpayers being able to fill out their taxes on a postcard is a big deal because of doubling that standard deduction and simplifying the code. Not only that, doubling the child tax credit from $1,000 per child per year to $2,000 per child per year. That's a big deal for young families, for families that are struggling, they're raising kids in terms of making ends meet. And we've seen in the last 2 months the fruits of this tax cut as company after company after company has announced bonuses, has announced pay raises, has announced billions in new investments in the United States, has announced billions in new investments in pension funds. One after the other, these bonuses. You know, I was flying back to Texas, it's on Southwest Airlines. Flight attendant walked up to me and hugged me and said, "Thanks for the bonus." Now, I will confess it was more than a little interesting to see Nancy Pelosi describe $1,000 bonuses as crumbs. I got to say, if those are crumbs, I want to see the cake. I'll tell you, for a lot of families who are struggling, those bonuses make a real difference. And the bonuses are just the beginning. Because this month in February is when people's pay stubs are coming through. When the tax cut starts to be reflected in their pay stubs, as we're seeing millions of Americans who are suddenly paying less in taxes. Who are paying less in taxes and able to spend more, whether it's saving for retirement, whether it's saving to buy a new home, whether it's saving to pay for their kids' education, whether it is saving to get braces for your daughter, or take your family to Disneyland, or repair your home or your car, or whatever the expenses are, it's more money in Texans' pockets. I think the tax bill will prove to have a profoundly positive effect on jobs and economic growth. I think it is particularly good for the state of Texas. And I'll note, as part of the tax bill, there were some significant conservative victories that I played a very active part in. One of the major victories in tax reform is that we repealed the Obamacare individual mandate. Now, that was a big deal. And I got to tell you, last fall, last October, I began pitching, let's repeal the individual mandate as part of tax reform. At the time, there were maybe a half dozen senators supporting me. It's me and a handful of conservatives. And most of the conference was skeptical. Most of the other Republican senators were saying, look, we tried on Obamacare, we couldn't get it done last year. Let's not muck up tax reform by getting back into those Obamacare issues. And I understand those sentiments. Those sentiments weren't crazy. But we began making the case both privately within the conference and also publicly to the American people. And the case we made was twofold. Number one, the individual mandate is one of the most unfair and oppressive parts of Obamacare. The way the individual mandate works, every year the IRS fines about 6.5 million Americans because they can't afford health insurance. Of those, roughly 1 million are in Texas. Roughly 80% earn $50,000 a year or less. Roughly 40% earn $25,000 a year or less. So imagine, if you will, you're a single mom. You're working a couple of jobs, working your fingers to the bone, trying to provide for your kids. You're not even making $25,000 a year. You can't afford health insurance because premiums have skyrocketed under Obamacare, and to add insult to injury, the IRS comes along and fines you because you can't afford health insurance. It's what led Bill Clinton to describe Obamacare as the craziest thing in the world. One of the very few times I'm willing to say I agree with Bill Clinton. So we argued repealing the individual mandate is meaningful tax relief to the 6.5 million people getting fined by the IRS under Obamacare, meaningful tax relief to the 1 million Texans getting fined. But the second whammy that was persuasive is the way the Congressional Budget Office scores repealing the individual mandate, is that it saves the federal government about $300 billion. And my view of the first version of the tax bill that came out of the House is it was a good start. It was really good on the business side. It didn't do nearly enough on the individual side. So what I urged everyone is let's do more. Let's take that $300 billion from repealing the mandate and put it all on the individual and family side. Let's reduce rates across the board. We made that case within the conference publicly. We made it in December. All 52 Republicans agreed with us, voted to repeal the individual mandate, and voted to use that $300 billion to lower individual rates, which is why we're seeing such significant reductions in taxes. It's how we paid for every rate being reduced. It's how we paid for doubling the child tax credit. And so the very real results working families are seeing is in significant part because of taking on and repealing the individual mandate. That was a big victory, and we went from no one thinking we had a prayer of doing it to getting it done. The second victory in the tax bill was an amendment I introduced on the Senate floor, became the only amendment that was actually adopted that added anything to the tax bill on the Senate floor. And it concerned school choice. It concerned college 529 savings plans. 529 savings plans are immensely popular. Millions of people across the country use them. It's a tax advantage vehicle where parents and grandparents can save for college expenses. The amendment I introduced takes college 529 plans and expands them, says you can still use them for college, that's great, but now you can also use them for K through 12 education, for elementary and secondary school education, for public school, for private school, for parochial school, for religious school. Whatever you decide, you as the parent, you as the grandparent, up to $10,000 per child per year. When it came for a vote, it ended up being fairly dramatic. The vote was after midnight on a Friday, early Saturday morning. It's clear it was going to be close. We had 52 Republicans in the conference. Initially, 2 Republicans vote no. At that point, the Senate floor staff picks up the phone and calls the Vice President's office and said, Mr. Vice President, looks like we might have a tie. We need you to come down here. Vice President was at his residence, so he goes and gets in the motorcade, starts heading down to the Capitol. I'm standing there along with Tim Scott, Senator from South Carolina. He's a great guy, trying to persuade one of the Republicans to switch their vote. Tim, before he was in the Senate, used to sell life insurance. And he sold 529 plans, and he said, look, parents love these. These things are fantastic, and it's their money. Why would you oppose helping people save their money for their kids in a tax-advantaged way? We're making the case, while we're making the case behind us, Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, walks down to the front and votes yes. It's an audible gasp, the well of the Senate. So, Senate floor staff picks up the phone, calls the Vice President's office, said, Mr. Vice President, we just got Manchin. Turns out we don't need your vote. So the Vice President turns his motorcade around, starts headed back. Manchin goes back to his desk, and a sea of Democrats descend on him and begin just chewing him out. I think they actually pulled out sticks and began whacking him with it. And after about 5 minutes, Manchin sheepishly walks down to the front of the Senate and shifts his vote to a no. So the Senate floor staff picks up the phone, calls the Vice President a third time, said, Mr. Vice President, we need your vote after all. He turns the motorcade around yet another time. Takes about 15 minutes to get from the Naval Observatory to the Capitol. 15 minutes later, Vice President walks onto the floor, says the ayes being 50, the nays being 50, the Senate being equally divided, the presiding officer votes in the affirmative, the amendment is adopted. And with that, we passed the most meaningful federal school choice legislation that has ever passed the U.S. Congress. That was a big, big victory benefiting up to 50 million school kids all across this country. So tax reform was a major victory. I believe honoring the promises we made to the American people. It's a major victory for Texas. Now, how about Reg Reform? Reg Reform has been another, I think, unalloyed victory of this administration. Every cabinet secretary I've spoken with, Reg Reform is among the very first words out of their mouth. we've seen, as I talk with Texas business leaders, every one of them describes a fundamentally different attitude of federal regulators not viewing them as the enemy, not trying to stop and stifle new businesses and job creation. In the environmental world, look, y'all are dealing with federal regulations all the time. It's very significant to see the administration pulling back on the waters of the United States rule. It's exactly the right thing to do. That rule was contrary to federal law, defining just about every puddle as navigable waters. Now, y'all are in the water business. Last I checked, puddles are not navigable. In fact, it reminds me of my favorite movie, The Princess Bride. You keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Let me see you get a ship and navigate on that puddle. And so seeing the administration pulling back from that burdensome regulation and burdensome regulations across the spectrum is very, very positive. That's something that I'm working very, very closely with the President and every cabinet agency in looking at rules and regulations that are killing jobs. And it's something I would invite each of you. Our office is happy to work with each of you as you're dealing with water issues in your jurisdictions. If you're running into federal regulations that are just needlessly driving up costs, needlessly imposing delay, work with us, because we're pursuing a threefold strategy on reg reform: executive action, regulatory action, and legislative action. And by the way, I think one of the best opportunities for legislative action on reg reform is infrastructure. I think we're likely to see an infrastructure bill pass in 2018. Both Republicans and Democrats want an infrastructure bill to pass in 2018. And I think it's the best opportunity to legislate reg reform. What I'm pushing is to incorporate structural reg reform as part of infrastructure. The case I'm making on the Commerce Committee is it doesn't do any good to spend billions of dollars on roads and bridges if you can't get a permit to build the dang road or bridge. Look, we're facing this right now in Houston and along the Gulf Coast as we rebuild from Hurricane Harvey, where in the course of rebuilding, people are running into NEPA reviews and delays and federal permitting that's just slowing everything down. So I'm working hard as part of Harvey Relief to put reg reform in there. And I'll tell you, it's interesting as I meet with county and local officials, many of them elected Democrats, I'm urging them, listen, they're coming to me saying, help us get relief from these regulations. And my response is, I'm with you, yes, convince your Democratic colleagues who are blocking it right now. But that's a valuable message to remove barriers that don't make any sense, that just slow things down, that just drive up costs and impose delay for no reason. Reg reform, I think, has been one of the biggest successes of this administration, and I am encouraged that we will see even greater successes going forward. Third big priority of Obamacare clearly is the biggest unfinished promise of this last election. I think Obamacare still remains the biggest job killer in this country. I think we need to continue to work to get the job done. But it's worth noting repealing the individual mandate is a big deal. It's a step in the right direction. A few months ago, nobody thought we had a prayer of getting that done. And then we came together and delivered on that. And my approach, I'm continuing to roll up my sleeves and work to try to bring together 50 Republicans to finish the job on Obamacare. And then finally, judges. Judges, likewise, has been another, I believe, unalloyed success of this administration and the Republican majority in the Senate. We have Justice Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, who I believe has been superb. In the federal courts of appeals, we confirmed 12 Court of Appeals judges. That is the most confirmed in the first year of a president's term in history. Nearly 7% of the federal appellate bench. By way of comparison, Obama had 4. We confirmed 12. And I can tell you, I had breakfast this morning with John Cornyn. He and I are talking about continuing to fill. We've got vacancies in Texas. We've been moving forward with strong, capable. 2 of those 12 on the Courts of Appeals were in Texas. Former Texas Supreme Court Justice Don Willett, former Solicitor General Jim Ho, 2 people I've known for 20 years. Strong, principled constitutionalists, devoted to the Bill of Rights, to protecting our fundamental liberties, free speech, religious liberty, the Second Amendment, the basic rights protected of every American. And for those of us who care about economic liberty, having courts that will enforce contracts, courts that will follow the law, provides a level of stability that we see in Texas, but that is not always true in the federal courts nationally. So looking back on 2017, I'm very encouraged by what we accomplished. But I also think we have a lot more work to do. And so the role that I am trying to play in this Congress, particularly in this Senate, is trying to bring together, we've got a narrow, fractious, shaky majority, just 51 Republicans, trying to bring together and forge consensus and get at least 50 Republicans on the same page with one simple message: let's do what we promised. Let's do what we said we would do. I think if we do that, we're honoring our commitments to the voters, but I think we're also producing real results. And all of those should be directed at what is my #1 priority, and that's jobs and economic growth. As I travel Texas, there's a consistency, whether you're in East Texas or West Texas, whether you're in the Panhandle or the Rio Grande Valley. Texans want jobs, higher wages, more opportunity. That's who Texas is. And if we can deliver on that, creating an environment where there's more opportunity to people to rise up and achieve the American dream, then we're doing the job we were elected to do. And with that, happy to answer a couple questions.
Senator, I have one question.
Okay.
I'd like to hear your opinion on, we hear of the Senate rules, and the big one that we hear of constantly is the 60-vote rule.
Yes.
What is your prerogative? What do you think is going to happen with that? Is there a way that the majority leader would ever go to a simple majority on some of these things so we can get something done?
Yeah. So, Tom, it's a great question. We are facing right now in the Senate an unprecedented level of filibusters. Look, Washington right now is more divided than it's ever been. I don't know how many of y'all watched the State of the Union. I mean, listen, it was striking. Half of Congress wouldn't stand and applaud more jobs, wouldn't stand and applaud higher wages, wouldn't stand and applaud unemployment going down, unemployment among African Americans going down, unemployment among Hispanics going down. I mean, to see virtually the entire Democratic caucus stone-faced at what are unambiguous wins for the American people, that was sad. That's unfortunate. The way that's manifesting in the Senate is we're seeing a filibuster of practically everything. Virtually every piece of legislation faces a Democratic filibuster. Let's take tax reform. Tax reform and tax cuts historically have been bipartisan. Ronald Reagan in 81 and 86, major tax cuts and tax reform. Did both of those with Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, as Speaker of the House. In 81, the Reagan tax cuts were carried by then a conservative Democrat from Texas named Phil Gramm. In 86, tax reform, one of the leaders in tax reform was Bill Bradley, a liberal Democrat from New Jersey. This time around, you know how many Democrats in the House voted for tax cuts? 0. Same number in the Senate. Not a single Democrat was willing to vote to cut your taxes. That is, we've never been there before. This is a weird time and place. So there's a lot of discussion about ending the filibuster. And I'll confess, my views on that have changed. So if you had asked me even 2-3 years ago, would I support ending the filibuster, I would have told you no. And the reason I would have said no is I think the filibuster over time has proven to be a conservative policy of slowing down the growth of big government. So what's changed? 2 things have changed, because now I would end the filibuster. I've changed my opinion on that. Two things have changed are, number one, the massive and total opposition of Democrats. We've never seen the minority party simply filibuster every single piece of legislation to come to the floor. But two, I don't believe the Democrats, if and when they get a majority again, will be bound by the filibuster. I believe the Senate Democrats that are here today would change it in a heartbeat. And so if it's only a one-way ratchet, if it only binds one side, that just seems to me stupid. So I would vote to change it. Now your question is that likely to happen? It's not likely to happen anytime soon. We don't have the votes in the Republican conference. The majority leader strongly opposes changing the filibuster. I don't even know that we have half the Republicans that would support changing the filibuster. That's changing. I mean, the demand of the far left base from Democrats, why did they all sit on what should be wins for the American people? Because their base is demanding fight, obstruct, resist, with a level of fury and rage we've never seen before. You know, we had a shutdown a couple of weeks ago that Schumer forced through. When Schumer gave in and allowed the government to reopen, that night he had left-wing protesters at his house who protested all night and said, we're not going to let Schumer sleep. That's the dynamic that's driving the conference. It's leading to a polarization that's unfortunate. And that dynamic means we're not going to have the vote to change the filibuster anytime soon. But I do think there are a lot of tools that we can use that you can pass things on 50 votes without changing the filibuster. For example, we used budget reconciliation to pass the tax cut. We used what's called the Congressional Review Act to rescind a number of Obama-era job-killing regulations. Judicial nominations and executive nominations now can't be filibustered, so the successes we've had on judges have been at a 51-vote threshold. So I've been urging using more and more tools that can pass things on 51, because the answer can't be, I can't go to Texans and say, well, gosh, Democrats are opposing everything, so we're going to do nothing. That's just not an acceptable answer to give Texans. We need to deliver results even if we're facing total resistance and opposition on the other side. So I think we ought to look to tools to honor our promises, and we've got a number of tools available. Do maybe one more question. Yes, sir.
Senator Andre McDonald from Fort Bend County, Texas. One of the principal reasons I'm here, and a number in this group are, is to see what we can do to help reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program. They passed it in the House. It's come to the Senate, and quite frankly, we don't see a clear path forward or leadership in the Senate pursuing that issue.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think we will see it reauthorized. It's tied up in the middle of broader negotiations right now. When it comes to flood insurance, I think we're likely to see some reforms to the program to make it a bit more fiscally responsible, and I think that makes sense. You know, I can tell you part of it is tied up in broader negotiations, and some of it is wrapped up with disaster relief. And following Hurricane Harvey, you know, Houston's my hometown. I lived through Hurricane Harvey. We had water up in our front yard, you know, just a few feet from our front door. Thankfully, our home wasn't flooded, but I have spent a lot of time in virtually every community up and down the Gulf Coast that was devastated by Harvey. And I will say, coming out of that hurricane, we saw an amazing degree of bipartisan cooperation. It really was starkly contrasting what you see in Washington and the atmosphere at the State of the Union. We saw just in the few days after Harvey, I joined with Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat from Houston. She and I together both testified in front of the Houston City Council. And we both testified today, there are no Democrats, there are no Republicans, we are Houstonians, we are Texans, we are standing as one. One of the city council members observed, Sheila was actually wearing red and I was wearing blue. And at that point, Sheila and I hugged. which I've joked may have simultaneously ended both our political careers. If you look at the aftermath of Harvey and what Washington was able to do, we saw some bipartisan cooperation with two different emergency relief bills. The first one came out of the House at $7.5 billion. It came to the Senate. John Cornyn and I took the lead on doubling that to over $15 billion in the Senate, which provided the first tranche of hurricane relief to Texas, billions of dollars on the ground. The second tranche, a little over $30 billion, that included the biggest piece of that, was refilling the flood insurance program, funding supplies to provide for the needs coming out of Harvey. And we again saw bipartisan cooperation on getting that done. The third thing we saw done last year was tax relief targeted at victims of Hurricane Harvey. And it was legislation I led in the Senate, the legislation I joined with John Cornyn and Marco Rubio, and it was the Cruz, Cornyn, Rubio legislation that provided that those impacted by Harvey can deduct their hurricane casualty losses from their taxes, that they can withdraw from their retirement savings, their IRA or 401k, without paying early withdrawal fees to rebuild their homes. It incentivized charitable giving for hurricane relief charities, and it also for companies, for businesses that kept paying employees during and after the hurricane. Even though the companies were shut down and no one could come to work, it created a tax credit because a lot of companies did the right thing and kept those paychecks going. That was billions of dollars of tax relief for those impacted by Harvey and Maria and Irma. And the Cruz, Cornyn, Rubio legislation passed both houses of Congress. The president signed it. And so that was real relief for the victims of those storms. That cooperation has faded in the new year. So we've got a third tranche of hurricane relief. It hasn't passed yet. I'm fighting hard to. At least so far, it's been caught up in the wrangling of every other issue. I pressed very hard to pass that back in October because my view is it should have been clean and separate and not tied to a continuing resolution or an omnibus, not tied to every other political fight in Washington. But instead, we should stay focused and have the consensus we saw before on providing the relief that Texans need and under federal law deserve and are entitled to. There's some indication we may see some movement on flood relief sooner rather than later. I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing this morning on that front. And I think when it comes to reauthorizing flood insurance program, we will see that, but it is right now captured by all the partisan wrangling on everything else. One of the consequences of that is that, wrongly I believe, I think hurricane victims are being held as hostages for fights unrelated to disaster relief. I don't think we should be doing that. So with that, I want to thank you guys for being here and say it's a privilege to be with you.